Welcome to our third session in this series of Future Proof Repositories. Today we have Luke Taylor presenting hosting and digital preservation. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is security in and around your repositories and your content. And Luke has been doing this for should I say a very long time? And I'd say you're you're a veteran anyway. It's a Hall of Fame career you're having so far, if there was a Hall of Fame for this type of thing. So yeah, with that, I'm going to let Luke take it away. I went over his presentation there yesterday, and I know that he doesn't need me blathering on about it. So I'll let you go ahead there, Luke.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the presentation on hosting and digital preservation, managing security for your collections. So before we get into this, I'd like to ask everyone to think about the types of issues they've had with bots, DDoS attacks, and behaviors they see on the internet. And I encourage you to leave comments in the chat. We're going to be getting more into this as we go through the presentation, and in particular towards the end, I'll talk about what we have seen and how we have dealt with it. I encourage you to leave comments, think about it a bit, and ideally we'll have enough time to have a pretty good discussion about it at the end of the presentation. So thank Jonathan for the introduction. I guess I am getting a little old. I've been with Discovery Garden for over 12 years, and I've been working within the broader IT community for over 20 years. My background is mainly in systems, infrastructure, cybersecurity, and technology leadership. So our agenda today, we're going to talk about different ways we see people hosting their digital repositories, and I'll talk about some things that people should probably consider before choosing a particular way of hosting. We're going to talk about how Discovery Garden handles storage and the considerations we have around that when it comes to preservation. And then we're going to get into talking about bot management, the types of things that I've been seeing, what I've done to stop them, and I'm also really curious about what other people have done to stop bot attacks. Getting into the hosting section, I'm going to focus on a couple different types of hosting that we see. So we have on-site data centers. So these are generally within a university, and also how we handle hosting in Amazon. I know there's some other varieties there. Some people might have hosting within Azure or Google, but I'm going to focus on these two areas. With that being said, at the end of the discussion, we can talk about what other people might be doing at different cloud vendors.
You mentioned Amazon, like that's mostly because we use Amazon internally, right? Whether it's Azure or it's somewhere else.
For us, we use Amazon. It's where our staff has the most expertise and experience, and it's where we've had the most success. We do support some people who do host within Azure and other types of setups. So that's where you get more into the Amazon-based hosting for us. But I know other people do have success in other cloud vendors, but I'm just going to talk about what we've done. And most of the things I'm going to talk about in Amazon, there is an equivalent in some of these other cloud vendors.
Actually, that's interesting. If there's anybody else on the call with a different experience, I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Sure. So we're going to talk a bit about hosting on site. So there is advantages to it. One advantage is that the data remains within the university. It's possible that you have requirements that the data has to be stored locally, and you could have a lot of storage capacity. So that is one advantage. Something else you should consider before choosing on site is your local IT team capacity. In many cases, your IT team might be stretched a little thin, and you need to consider, do they have the capacity to actually help manage the underlying systems for a new step? I know for myself, like I've worked with local IT in the past. I worked with servers and data centers back when I was a Windows system administrator. I know some people might find that surprising, but I did have a previous career as a Windows system administrator, and it was challenging at times because you have to manage what physical capacity you have versus what the requests are for incoming resources. Another consideration is, does your team have the ability to make use of any managed services? So in a lot of cases, there's appliances you can get to integrate into your data center. A good example of this would be a web application firewall. And when I say managed, ideally this web application firewall has rules that are automatically updated by a vendor, so you don't have to worry about managing them because they would have the intelligence to know what types of bot attacks are happening, and they can automatically update them to block attacks before they happen. And we're going to talk a bit about limitations around local hardware and considerations you have to take in terms of being able to scale. We're also going to talk a bit about some of the costs that you might encounter that you should consider if you're going to be going on site. So hosting on site can be very cost effective and desirable if you have the available staff and the hardware. I will say it generally takes a lot more work up front for us to work with it, because in a lot of cases, we may not have familiarity with what the local infrastructure is. And so there's generally a lot of coordination with your IT team to get the installation set up. Another important aspect for us is familiarity with Kubernetes. So we use Kubernetes for all of our installations now. I know a lot of other people in the community use it as well. It's pretty effective at orchestrating workloads. And ideally, if you're hosting on site, your staff has familiarity with it. Maybe you have an existing Kubernetes cluster that can be leveraged. Another consideration for costs is if you will need support from other vendors, like you probably have support contracts with VMware and Cisco, and I mentioned WAF, you may need to have a contract with a WAF vendor to be able to implement a web application firewall. So in terms of on-site storage, normally in most cases what we see is there's a NAS, so that's a network attached storage. So it's usually a network device that has a large number of disks in it that is available over the network, and we would connect to that using NFS. We also require block storage, and in some cases, people actually have their whole repository on block storage. So we see a variety of both. One thing you should keep in mind with your local storage is that any future growth requirements, so you should try to get an idea of how much your repository is going to be growing over the years, and you're going to need to plan that into your budget. So like you may run into situations where if you're ingesting a lot more than expected, you may not have the storage space in order to accommodate that. So it's very important to plan that in. Another thing that is I would say quite a strong consideration is how does your storage handle backups and disaster recovery? You always should make sure your backups are maintained offline. And when I say offline, it means it can't be accessible by the systems running the actual application. So that could be snapshots, or you could have some other job that's taking backups where the system itself can't access it. The reason why that's very important is that if the backups are accessible by the system that you're taking the backups of, if you ever encountered a ransomware attack, let's say, it would actually encrypt your system and the backups, and you wouldn't be able to recover. I know in the past where we've dealt with a lot of different internal infrastructures, and we have run into situations where people have actually had their backups mounted as NFS to the server running the application. In that case, we had a discussion. I pointed out the risks of that, and we helped them make changes to make sure that wasn't an issue anymore. So it's just something very important to point out. And another thing with backups is ideally you should have a way of taking backups that exist outside of your data center. So maybe you could use an S3 bucket or some other sort of cloud storage. Possible you have another data center where you can send the backups. And the reason for that is if there ever was a disaster and your data center caught fire or something bad happened, that you still have your data somewhere else.
Luke, there was a quick question in the chat there. Gary Gordon was asking about SANs, and so I think that's related to your last slide there.
That's another example. There's other examples of local storage types that people can use. That is an example of another one.
So, Carrie, you might be using those on site as well. I would love to hear more about that, maybe towards the end of the presentation there. We can ask some questions about that.
So for deployments and installations, we make use of images and containers. Ideally, if your local staff has existing Kubernetes infrastructure, it'd be great because then we could just deploy Helm charts right into it. If you don't have an existing Kubernetes infrastructure, we could install micro K8s, and that could be installed on one or more servers depending on your needs. And micro K8s is effectively just more of a ready to go Kubernetes installation, and it's a lot less work. We ourselves don't generally set up Kubernetes from scratch. Even within our own hosting, we make use of Amazon's managed Kubernetes service. So with our support and maintenance, the hardware and systems and network are maintained by the local IT department, and then Discovery Garden takes care of the application maintenance and monitoring of the application itself. When it comes to monitoring, generally there's monitoring from both the local IT team as well as Discovery Garden because there's interconnected systems there. For logging, we use a managed service called Grafana, and that is a tool that provides detailed central logging, metrics, and uptime, and it tells us it provides alerts and different information on what's happening within a Kubernetes cluster. We also make use of that with our hosted clients as well, and we find that it provides a great deal of information. It can be a little pricey, but we found it quite good. So we talked about hardware constraints. So I think you need to look at what your requirements are in terms of uptime. Does your stack need to be able to grow automatically? Do you have very high availability requirements? So you need to look at what your local hardware constraints are. Do you have systems in place that are able to spin up servers, take them down, ideally be in some sort of managed Kubernetes cluster? And that kind of comes in with the ability to handle spikes and load. Maybe some people are running a lot of large ingests. Another factor with local infrastructure is, in a lot of cases, we end up seeing people, and we actually usually request this, is sometimes we over provision resources, in particular around migrations. There's usually a much higher need for capacity during migrations because it uses a lot of CPU, memory. And then once the migration's done, we tell the client or the local IT department that you can scale things back. But even day to day, I normally recommend having the servers having a higher capacity than needed, just to just so you can deal with those spikes. That is, unless you have other means to have some sort of auto scaling that can take servers up and down. So some considerations around on-site security. One thing I recommend that everybody has is what's known as an EDR. So what an EDR is, it stands for endpoint detection and response. So it serves as an antivirus, but it's much more than that. It's capable of antivirus, malware, but it also can actually detect and block hacking attempts. So it uses AI to actually observe behaviors on your system. And if it detects something that seems odd or that it interprets as a hacking attempt, it will actually block it and alert you. So it's mostly standard these days. In a lot of cases, you won't be able to get cybersecurity insurance unless you have it. So it's strongly recommended if you don't already have EDR set up on your local systems. I would say the most critical thing to consider and I know other people are probably going to speak to this, for local or anywhere as you go to host, is the ability to manage internet-based attacks. So do you have appliances or tools that can effectively block bot attacks? So you may have all the hardware you need to set up a large-scale repository, but it very well could end up performing poorly or be down frequently due to these types of attacks. So in most cases, when I see sites that we host locally, or even that other people host, when they're performing slow and they're down frequently, in a lot of cases, especially in the last year, I would say it is normally bots. And we're going to talk a lot more about bots later, but I think that's very critical. Wherever you're hosting, make sure you have an effective way of dealing with bots. And there's a lot of different ways you could approach this. But in most cases, you want to have some sort of managed service or appliance doing that job for you. It's not effective for you to try to be blocking these bot attacks yourself. And we're going to talk about why later, but it's not effective anymore. And a lot of the host-based tools have lost effectiveness as well. So I strongly recommend having some sort of appliance or CDN, some people have had success with Cloudflare. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. In situations where clients do have bot attacks on site, we do take steps to try to help, and we've tried implementing a number of different tools to try to help people. Generally speaking, though, it's always going to be the responsibility of whoever's hosting the infrastructure to manage the traffic. It's usually outside of the scope of general support. We still do our best to help, but in some cases, we could take extra steps with your IT department to protect the site. But in those cases, it would need a separate contract with us.
Luke, let me ask, we just knowing who was invited to this presentation, we do have a lot of librarians and whatnot in the call here and in the invite list. Maybe not people as experienced on the infrastructure side as everything else, but to deal with bot attacks, with DDoS attacks. Can we just step back a little bit? Tell me, what is a DDoS attack? Tell me what are the bots doing when they attack a site?
So I was going to talk about getting into more detail later, but I certainly can describe some of it now to give a better level of understanding. A DDoS attack is a distributed denial of service attack. And what that means is, on the internet, you have multiple IP addresses, and an IP address is the address of a system that is used to interact with it on the internet. So you have multiple IP addresses attacking your server with traffic that does not serve any purpose. And it's not that the traffic's necessarily malicious in itself, that it's trying to hack you. The intent of the traffic is to take your site offline or to make it perform poorly. In most cases, you may ask, why are they doing this? What are they getting out of this? It's usually, there's a variety of reasons. It could be they're trying to cause economic harm. They may just be trying to take the site down for political reasons. It could be state funded. There's a lot of reasons why they do this. But DDoS attacks are a significant threat on the internet, and it makes running a website in the internet very hard if you don't have ways of stopping these types of attacks. There's a lot of different methods you can use to stop them. Some of them are not as effective as they used to be, and we're going to be talking a bit more about that later.
Okay, excellent. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so in this section, we're going to talk a bit more about hosting with Discovery Garden and some different areas we're going to cover. So with Discovery Garden, as I mentioned, we use AWS for all of our hosting, and it's fully managed. So we do handle bots. We handle the backups, uptime, maintenance, take care of the underlying systems that run the application. And we're going to go through each one of these sections. We're going to talk about scalability, security. We're going to talk about SOC 2, traffic, how we handle our preservation storage. And then we're going to talk about different ways that we can host that might be of interest for some people that still allow potential use to still have an on-site installation. And again, we use Grafana central logging. So in terms of scalability, one of the good things with Amazon is that it has the ability to scale on demand, and especially if you're making use of a lot of managed AWS services. So we make use of EKS, so it's Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service. So that is where all of our nodes are stored that host the application, and it has the ability to bring nodes up and down on the fly. And then there's also RDS serverless, which can grow the database and shrink it vertically without impacting the running application. So you may have a job that's running that's taking up a lot of CPU power, and then it can shrink back down once that job passes. And we also make it highly available so that if something goes down, we have the ability to bring it up very quickly in a different availability zone. The storage ability in Amazon is unlimited, so we don't have to plan out the capacity of how much we need for an institution. And we're going to talk a bit more about our S3 storage later that can grow indefinitely. Another good thing about using some of these managed services, so like with RDS, for example, it offers a much higher level of logging and metrics and query intelligence that we don't get just from Postgres running on a server or container. So in most cases, when we do installations on site, we would either use like a Postgres that's provided by a client, so they may have an existing cluster, or we would install Postgres using a container or potentially on a server itself, depending on what's available to us. So the good thing with RDS is it has all these tools in it, and it can provide a very high level of intelligence to help manage your stack. So we're going to talk a bit about our security section. So we're going to go through a few tools that we use to help manage the security for our hosted clients. Some of these aren't limited to AWS, like we already talked about EDR. With CrowdStrike, Tagus is a vulnerability scanner. There's many different types out there, and that's not at all specific to Amazon. And a lot of organizations would already be familiar with SOC 2. That also is not specific to Amazon. So we're just going to go through each of these sections, and near the end, we'll wrap up with talking about the bot. So at Discovery Garden, we use AWS Guard Duty to monitor our accounts, systems, flow logs, VPCs. And what Guard Duty does is it's an Amazon run tool that detects unusual behavior or possible hacking attempts. So we get alerts from this. We get alerts from it every once in a while. In most cases, it's from something we were doing that was like unusual. So in this particular case, it's an example of an alert that we receive. And in this case, one of our servers was communicating with the DNS resolver that wasn't expected. And for those people here, DNS stands for Domain Name Service, and it's what is used on the internet. So when you're visiting a website and you type in like google.com, you're actually going to an IP address, and the DNS is what takes that name and sends you to the IP address, just to give clarity in that. So in this particular case, it's an alert saying that this server is communicating with a DNS server that it never normally does. And Guard Duty flagged that as unusual, which is great. In this particular case, it was actually us. We were just testing something. So we use CrowdStrike for EDR. So as I mentioned earlier, that's our endpoint response system that works as an antivirus and anti-hacking, and it has intelligence around it, and it provides a lot of detail when something happens, and it allows us to backtrace when the thing occurred and where it came from. And in this particular case, this is an example of an alert that we got. So in this case, it was actually Akansha, and she was testing out a test malicious file to see if it would actually generate the alert. And in this case, it did. So nothing bad happened here. It was just us testing something, but it just gives you an idea of that we are getting alerts all the time from these services that we look at and investigate if there's anything suspicious going on. We use Tagus VDR, so that stands for Vulnerability Detection and Response. And what this is, it's a vulnerability scanner that we use to scan our systems, and it alerts us of any vulnerabilities that might not have been previously detected. So it's capable of carrying out a very detailed level of scanning, and it uses machine learning and AI to actually detect vulnerabilities that may not have been known or published. So it actually tries to carry out cross-site scripting attacks, and it carries out different types of behaviors, and it alerts us to things that we didn't even realize existed because it was never published or there was never a patch for it. So in this particular case, in the screenshot, I'm reviewing what the results were for this particular system. In this case, it's a test system we have, and it's alerting us saying that it detected that it's running an end-of-life 777. So in this case, it's actually not an issue for us because our 777 sites are actually still being maintained because we have an arrangement with a vendor to be able to keep 777 going. So this is an example and it lets us know why the alert happened. If there's a CVE for it, it provides it to us. And I should say CVE, it's a published number associated with a vulnerability. There's a database of them. So in some cases, it's a known thing, and that's where that comes from. So I'm going to get more into the bot attacks later, but for hosting, we use AWS. So WAF stands for Web Application Firewall, and it's a purpose-built service that is designed to block attacks and keep sites safe. And in our case, we use a number of managed rules that intelligently block these attacks. And in this particular screenshot, it just shows the type of information we get out of it. So we actually have a lot of graphs and reporting that provides us insight into the traffic that's going through it. So in this case, it's a 3-hour window on a particular site, and it can tell you like the total number of hits in the site, what was blocked, allowed. One interesting thing about this is you can see the percentages underneath it, and you'll notice there's a huge drop in the amount of challenges that were issued. And just looking at this screenshot, I can tell that it had a rise in bot attacks. It issued a bunch of challenges, and then it dropped off again because the bots gave up. And I'll show a couple other screenshots from the type of reporting information we get from this a bit later, but it just gives you an idea of how the web application firewall works.
Interesting here, of course, as well, that close to a quarter of all the traffic was blocked, like almost 40,000 hits.
The blocking is variable depending on if the bots give up or not. It can be way higher than this. But in this case, this is just I just grabbed a screenshot of a particular point in time, but I've seen it far higher than that in terms of what's being blocked. So the bots tend to be smart. They'll attack a site for a period of time. And then after, I've seen it was about an hour on the dot, they see that they're not getting anywhere, and then it drops off and they move on to attack somebody else. So SOC 2. So SOC 2 is a widely recognized compliance framework, and it establishes best practices to help maintain appropriate controls for your company as well as your customer data and applications. So Discovery Garden has worked with a Canadian security firm, Carbide, for the last 3 years, and we've developed a comprehensive set of policies and controls to meet SOC 2 compliance requirements. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time in this slide to talk about some of the flexibility and things that we can do with hosting, and it might give others ideas if you have, maybe you're self-hosting. So with Discovery Garden, you're not necessarily limited to having the storage with us within S3 buckets that reside within our organization. We have the capability of interacting with S3 buckets anywhere in Amazon. So if you have your own Amazon account, you could have your repository storage in that S3 bucket, and we would set up a AWS S3 gateway endpoint to be able to interact with that bucket securely. And then with that, you could maybe have a requirement to maintain control of that data. That would give you that, and it could also potentially help lower costs. In that scenario, the bucket is your responsibility, so you would be responsible for making sure that any other backups or anything you want to do with it would be your responsibility, but that is an option. I should point out, even people who have their S3 buckets with us, that we provide clients the ability to be able to interact with the bucket directly as read-only. So if they want to pull anything out, they have the ability to do that. So I want to talk a bit about hybrid hosting. So I've been giving this a lot of thought because of the types of challenges I've been seeing with some people who have a local data center. They have tons of capacity, they have staff, but there still might be some challenges there due to the bots, which is a big one, and other issues. So in this particular setup, you would have your on-site application on your hosting, and it would be firewalled from the internet, and you would be allowing your administrative staff access to it to carry out ingests, to run complex jobs, make bulk edits. And then on Discovery Garden side, we would have a public facing version of the site. The hosting would be a lot cheaper though than what we normally would charge, because we could shut down everything related to ingest. So a lot of the bulk edit jobs and ingest tasks cause the compute needs and cause a lot of the things that needed to run the application to increase, which leads to the need for higher hosting costs. But if we did it this way, we could have like a stripped down version of the site that is just the public facing site. It would be protected by a WAF, and we would manage keeping it up and making sure it's performant for the public. And then internally, in a protected sense, you could have all your staff operating on using the systems. Your local IT staff could get familiar with things and build capacity over time. And the advantage of this is that we could use AWS Data Sync and some other tools, and basically once a day or on whatever schedule you want, we'd be syncing up the changes from the local site. And there's a few advantages here that we should consider, is that you have security separation because your public site's up here, you have all your write access happening within your organization, and you have the ability to cut over the DNS. So in the situation, I mean, it's unlikely to happen, but in a situation that something happened with Amazon, you could easily cut the DNS over to your local installation. If there's an issue locally where you stop being able to ingest or something bad happened, you could cut the DNS over to the Discovery Garden, and we could fire up the components needed to ingest, and we would scale the system accordingly. And then eventually, another possibility is once you build up the capacity internally, you understand, your users understand things more, they know how to set up the jobs properly, then you could potentially get rid of the Discovery Garden hosted and just have the local. So it creates a great deal of flexibility. It would have some extra costs associated with it because you're having this other site running within Amazon, but it opens up a lot of different options. What we've noticed is a lot of times with new repositories, when their users start using it, there's usually a go live period where everybody's getting familiar with how to use the application. And there's times where somebody might run a bulk edit on potentially hundreds of thousands of objects, and something might not be set up with it, and it could end up causing issues with the database, or you might damage data that you didn't intend to due to administrative action of one of your users. And then you're in a situation where, okay, we have to roll back the database to fix this. In this particular type of setup I mentioned, the public site wouldn't be impacted by it, and you could still figure out the issue locally, and then you could roll back. This type of hybrid setup isn't just related to on-site or hosted either. It's also a possibility to have separate clusters that act this way within Amazon. So it's just something maybe people can think about. We could discuss it a bit more later. I do think there is some advantages to it for certain organizations, in particular those that are struggling with bot attacks and the bots are impacting their users' ability to work day to day.
Yeah, it sounds like an innovative solution, hybrid, hey? So more security, but I think you said it would be lower on the overall needs for storage and capacity, right? You keep everything local in your local infrastructure that way. Doesn't need to be cloud stored in terms of the content.
No, you would still have, so the storage in Amazon and S3 is relatively cost effective. And especially if we did something where you had your own S3 bucket, you would basically have, we would use AWS Data Sync to keep the storage synced. You would still need to have the storage available in a performant way to the actual public application running within Amazon. You would still want that there. And I think one of the main reasons for this, a lot of it is going to be people who have a local infrastructure and they want to keep using it. And they may have all their users on site. They may have the data on site that they want to stage. So this gives a pretty good option and gives a very effective disaster recovery method that it could just be switching over DNS.
Yeah, quite innovative. So we do have about 20 minutes left as you go on to your next slide. If there's any questions and whatnot, I'd love to see them in the chat so that we can get to them in a timely fashion towards the end of the presentation here. Yeah, thanks, Luke.
So we'll talk a little bit here about how we handle storage and preservation. At Discovery Garden, we utilize S3 for storage. So S3 stands for Simple Storage Service, and it's what's known as a blob store, and it needs APIs to interact with it. So it's not like a disk that you just plug in your computer or have sitting in your server somewheres, or even like an NFS mount. It's a type of storage that you interact with using APIs. We use mechanisms within Drupal called the Fly system to interact with it. The main advantages of S3 is that it's very durable. It has 11 nines of durability. Every object you're putting in an S3 bucket is replicated across 3 different data centers within a region. So if one of those data centers or availability zones went away, so a whole data center could blow up, the data would still be fine. In addition, for us, we use bucket replication to replicate that same data to a completely separate account that's outside of our organization. And we do that on the very rare chance our account ever got hacked. All the data is safe in another account. We also make use of versioning. So every object that goes into an S3 bucket is versioned and nothing's ever deleted. So if somebody deletes a file or creates new versions, just another version's deleted. If it's deleted, there's a delete marker. So the data's always there. And for those older versions, they're sent to Glacier Deep Archive for cost-effective preservation. For the metadata and the actual object level changes, we have database backups and everything that store that, but we also make use of what's known as content sync that keeps an ongoing export of any object changes or metadata changes, and it exports that out into a YAML format, into a folder structure that is stored with your repository data. The advantage of that is that these files are also versioned, and you could actually use those files to recreate your content in a completely separate Drupal site if you wanted to. Within Drupal, we also have revisions, and we make use of a module called DJI Fixity, which can be used to create checksums, and it can send you reporting information on that. DJI Fixity makes use of file hash, which is it's a Drupal module that already exists out there that takes checksums of everything. In addition, S3 itself has its own checksumming mechanisms, and S3 is capable of being self-healing. So it uses like redundancy checks between all these different data centers, and it can automatically repair corrupt data. So this slide I want to bring up because it's important it's not directly related to hosting. This can be used anywheres. I think it was important to bring up in terms of preservation, just to talk about it a little bit. So this is our Foxmole migration framework that we use. And when I talk about Foxmole, that's the file structure in Fedora 3 that reside within the Kubera file system. So this is from the old Islandora 7 installations that many still have to migrate. So we use the Foxmole migration framework to migrate all that data, and it utilizes the underlying Drupal migration framework to facilitate that. So we have a way of using this where we can actually reuse your existing Islandora file system so that there's not a need to regenerate derivatives or to re-ingest your binaries into Islandora 2.0. With this system, we could actually take the existing file system and run the migration, and it just creates pointers to the original binaries in the old file system, and it's mounted against the system as read-only. So the advantages of this is that it's very safe, that you're not going to run a risk of anything being lost because it's still within that file system. So if there's ever something that maybe you said you didn't want to migrate, but you want to go back and consider that later, that information's still there that can be looked at and retrieved. So we've come a long way with this framework. We've been working on it over time. We've run it with many different institutions, and as of our last large migration, so that was with the University of Iowa, we were able to migrate up to 1 million objects per week using this framework. So we've got it to the point where it's very fast, multi-threaded, effective, and it's cost effective because you don't have a need to duplicate your data. when you're migrating. So it's come a long way and we're continuing to work on it. But yeah, I know it's in the hosting section, but it's not specific to our hosting. Anybody can take this and use this. All right, so let's get into our bot section. I think this is probably going to drive any discussion towards the end of this presentation. I have a slide here with an image that it shows a graph from Cloudflare. So for those of you who don't know, Cloudflare is a very large content delivery network provider. It's one of the largest in the world. And they every quarter they publish information on what type of threats they're seeing and what types of traffic they're seeing. So I have a reference to the blog post there. You could go there and try to see trends that they report over time. So you could see in the graph over the last year, there's been a steady rise in bot attacks, but look at what happened in Q1. That is a 509% year-over-year increase, which is huge. And I've noticed this myself with their own systems, that there has been a change, in particular in Q1, in these attacks. And we're going to talk a bit more about this and what I've been seeing. With Discovery Garden, we have 54 Island Door clients worldwide. We have clients in Canada, Europe, Asia. Like we have quite a few different clients and a lot of clients that are US-based. Something I've been observing, and maybe other people, I don't know if anybody else here has noticed this as well, but there's been a new type of attack I've been seeing. It's still a DDoS attack, but the style of it's different. And these attacks seem to be coming from countries that are associated with BRICS. So that's like Brazil, Russia. There's a set of countries that it seems to be coming from. And I've noticed the way these attacks work is if you're observing the access logs, it usually starts with a very high up in IP range, but you might see it go like 121, 122, 123, and it's jumping between these IP subnets, but over a very large range of IPs, and they're all specific to a country. Or sometimes you might see a couple of the different countries, but the behavior is similar. And you can always tell they're bot attacks just from a trained eye. You can always tell a bot attack because you don't see any CSS being hit. You don't see the normal user behaviors. So there's certain patterns you can notice. That's one thing I've noticed with these attacks. So it's very almost like mechanical, like in the way it's organized. Another thing, these are my own observances. I like to see what other people are seeing as well. I've noticed these types of attacks that are very large, very broad, and extremely hard to block. They seem to be mostly targeted at US-based sites. And what's interesting is a lot of the sites that are being hit, you can't necessarily tell that is a US site from the URL. So it makes me wonder if there's some sort of AI at play here that might be crawling the sites, and it can figure out that it's a US-based site based on the content of it. But it's been noticeable. And like I said, I haven't seen it against like Canadian or European sites, but I have been noticing it against most of the American sites we support. One thing we've noticed in particular for people who are hosted on site is that a lot of the host-based controls that have worked for the last 10 years, they're updated and there's mechanisms to them. So that's like the bad bot blocker, CrowdSec. There's a number of them. They don't work anymore against these types of attacks, or not effectively, just because of the scale and the way they're working. They just don't work properly anymore. The only way I can see to effectively block any of this is to use a web application firewall or a combination of a CDN and a WAF, or just like a CDN that has WAF capabilities. So around host-based controls, I know there's people that have been trying to add different host-based controls, and we're interested in this because there's some clients we had that they don't have the in-house appliances to be able to block these. So the one thing, I don't know if anybody else some other people here might be able to comment, is Joe Corral's Turnstile, which utilizes Cloudflare. So I'd be curious what other people have to say about that. But yeah, so I will say that out of all these large-scale attacks, it has not impacted the people we have behind the WAF. And a lot of that is due to using a lot of the managed rules that we're using with Amazon. So we use managed rules within Amazon that have machine learning. So it can actually predict and change based on what the attacks are. And it's also very good at letting good traffic through. So things like harvesters, OAI, Google, Bing bot, it's good at letting those through, but while also blocking the bad traffic. And as I said, like we have not had any of our sites behind the web application firewall go down or be impacted by these. The WAF's been effective at blocking these types of attacks. We mostly make use of challenges versus CAPTCHAs, because CAPTCHAs are far more expensive. So if you know what a CAPTCHA is, when you're at a site, there's images, you can click on them to solve, like how many fire hydrants do you see? So we don't generally use those because they're more expensive. So we use challenges. And what the challenge is, it's JavaScript that runs in the browser that's injected by Amazon, and it can actually detect if it's a mouse or not. And then it knows it's a bot because it's not a person. So we've had pretty good success with this using the Amazon bot managed bot rule. And there's other rules that we put in place that are quite effective. And I'm realizing that we're coming pretty close to the end of time here, so I probably should close things up here and see what kind of questions people might have.
Yeah, and just on that, thanks, Luke. This was your last slide there. Just for there was one question in the chat there. I mentioned Island Oricon. Luke, I believe you're actually speaking at Island Oricon, correct?
Yes. So I'm going to Island Oricon, and I'll be talking about other things. Probably bots. Bots are always going to be a discussion.
Yeah, for anybody who's interested in Island Oricon, of course, you can get that at islandora.ca. Any information there, it is from July 14th to 17th. According to the commenter here, I didn't actually double check that myself, but I believe that is the case from the last time I was looking. And there's also here from Gary, should know that they can and should manage the scraping policies of Google and Bing. And that would obviously help out with some of the traffic there as well. Yeah, excellent. Of course, if there's any other questions, we can keep going for a few minutes. I know that people probably have to get to their next call here in a few minutes if they are scheduled to be somewhere else, but happy to answer any questions. Thanks, Luke. Are there any final thoughts? You rest through that last slide there. What do you think about moving forward, obviously, with the changes in bot traffic? What does the next 6 months look like in terms of security for these types of sites?
I think maintaining good managed rules is important. So if you need a WAF or an appliance that is a managed service that another organization that does this, that's all they do, they're managing some of the main rules so they can intelligently block some of these attacks. I also think people should consider blocking known hosting providers outside of Google being good ones, because in a lot of cases, there's no need for hundreds of EC2 instances to be hitting your site. That's not a user. So you'll see that in a lot of cases. So there's rules that actually do that in Amazon. You could say no in data centers.
Do you have another question here from Brandon? Do you have a documented collection of managed rules that you recommend we employ?
I can share what we do in Amazon. I don't specific to like other providers, but I do have what we use in Amazon, and I certainly can share the managed rules that we use.
And I would guess that you probably have some yourself or anybody else employing one of these systems. You have the ability to make any changes, any customizations in terms of some of those rules as well, I would guess, eh?
You're going to have a degree of customization. Ideally, once you get your site stable and you're making these changes, you're not going to have to change them very often. Occasionally, you might want to go in and make the odd tweak as you observe traffic trends, but most of the time, the managed rules are pretty effective once you get them configured properly.
Perfect. Okay, looks like we've answered all the questions. Hope to see everybody at Island Oricon.
Before we break, Jonathan, has anybody tried Joe Corral's turnstile module with the CDN? How do you find it's working, Carrie?
You have to make him a contributor.
Okay.
Before he can unmute himself.
Yeah, we can probably do that. Joe Corral is in attendance.
Carrie.
Oh, yeah. Joe's here. Maybe we could talk about this.
So I have made Joe a contributor.
Carrie also raised his hand. Sorry, Jonathan, Carrie also raised his hand.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Carrie did as well. Yeah, we can do that. There we go. And Carrie is now a contributor. Should be able to, yeah.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, I just
Hi.
showed up. So I'll let Joe speak to Turnstile. We're working with Turnstile, some sites. We're doing our preferred way of dealing with this is AWS WAF. I think that's the gold standard. Since we deal mostly with smaller, our biggest clients are probably smaller than your smallest clients, but so mostly we're under a lot of restraint. One thing we have been doing, not actually on Islandora sites, but sites that work similarly in terms of searching and faceting, is we block direct access to search results. So unless you go through the search page, you get a message like you have to go through the search page. In some places that might be inconvenient, but it has been pretty effective and these are much smaller sites with very specific audiences. So that's been very effective for us.
Okay. And maybe Joe can talk to Turnstile. Has anybody used the Turnstile stuff live yet?
We are using it, by the way.
Oh, you are using it?
Yeah, we are using it, but only on one site so far. We'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Joe, I don't know if you. Hi, Joe.
I've heard of a handful of folks that are using it. A couple Islandora sites. I know Princeton has the Trafic plugin running in front of their whole stack, I believe. It seems like it's working well enough for if you're self-hosted and you don't have the option of a WAF. You're still getting the traffic, so you're not like outright blocking it. You're basically just redirecting it and challenge them with the Turnstile challenge. So there's two ways of doing that. I wrote a Trafic plugin. So if you're using Trafic, which if you're using IO, you're using Trafic, you can just add it as middleware. And that's a lot more performant than the Drupal module. The Drupal module is another option where if you're not using Trafic or if you have just a normal Drupal website, you could just install it as a normal Drupal module. I mean, it does a similar thing where if it starts seeing increased traffic from ranges of IPs, it starts redirecting them and challenging them. If they can't pass the challenge, they're not able to proceed.
Okay. How do you find the load with it? Do you still see load spikes so that it drops off, or what observances are you seeing with that?
Yeah, we'll still see. So we have alerts if our server load spikes. And so what typically happens is about once a week, I'll see a spike. It lasts a minute and then the challenge starts getting tripped. I think there's probably some work I could do around. Right now I have a TTL on these rate limits. And I think what's happening is once that TTL expires, then it's like forgets all the rate limit from yesterday. And so I think that's what's going on is just like once a week, that sort of those things will correspond at the right time and there'll be a spike from minute. It doesn't affect the actual site itself. Our server load just spikes, but then the rate limiter kicks back into gear and then it handles everything. I guess that hasn't pushed me to try to fix that, I guess, since it's working. But yeah, it's really performant, especially the Trafic plugin. It's running and go, so it's super fast. So there's not much challenge there.
I think Carrie had a question.
Yeah, also, this is actually, we are experimenting with using a stack, not for Islandora so much as with other sites, but a stack of Nginx, Trafic, and open source blocker that I can't remember the name of, and then the Drupal site for sites where we want everything on one server where we don't want to be running 4 servers. And so we just build a Docker stack to do that. But what was I going to say? Oh, another thing we ran into, if you're using RDS, I think the default open time for queries is like 8 days or something like that. It's very long. Reduce that to a few minutes, because when you start getting hit by bots, if you don't get to them first, they're just going to open up a million of these and bring your server down. I don't know anyone that's happened to, of course, but I've been told that can happen. Obviously, it's happened to us. But yeah, so that's something to watch out for.
Yeah, so I really appreciate some of the feedback here. So we are we're going to look at some of the stuff you're doing, Joe, for some of our clients that don't have the ability to effectively block the bot attacks locally because they don't have the infrastructure to be able to do it. Yeah, it's really interesting, the work you've been doing. I am curious, has anybody else noticed the type of behavior I've described where these attacks are coming from what seems to be like BRICS associated countries? Like I've seen a lot from Brazil in particular, also China. Like there's some the ones you would normally see, but I've seen a huge rise in from Brazil. And also I noticed the behavior from all these countries is if you look at all the ASNs, it's 121, 122. And if you look at the patterns, like they almost go in a sequence. I don't know if anybody else has seen this or observed this, but it's something I've seen on multiple sites.
Yeah, it's very similar to what we see. We see the BRICS countries and also Eastern Europe. We're getting like Romania and places like that. But yeah, that seems to be the pattern.
Do you host just American sites or do you have?
Yes.
Okay. I'm curious if anybody else who doesn't. Yeah. Okay. So Sean Murphy, thank you. Yeah, it's exactly what I'm seeing. It's very similar and it's very hard to block. Like I said, a lot of the traditional tools that have been set up in a lot of systems, it needs a CDN. So that's why I'm really curious about Joe's, how he got it working with Turnstile. Because a lot of cases you can't just slap a CDN in front of something. I mean, that it's going to be able to cache everything effectively. But so I don't see a way to actually have a system up in the internet these days without having some sort of WAF or CDN mechanism like Joe has that actually can block these things, because it just overwhelms any host-based tools from what I've seen.
Yeah, so for what it's worth, it's not a CDN that it's still hitting your host. It's just when there's a traffic spike, it'll redirect. And actually, we have it redirecting now pretty much for everybody. Like it doesn't even wait we pretty much got rid of the rate limiter just because it's been so distributed. But it's still hitting the host, and it just redirects to an HTML page that has a turnstile loaded in it, and it requires you to pass that turnstile CAPTCHA sort of challenge. And then once you do that, it sets on the back end that you passed, you're good. This client IP is good, and then it lets you through.
Okay, so basically it's almost like an I'm under attack mode where if it senses that if there's too much hitting the server, it just redirects everybody to the actual turnstile.
Yeah, and that's how it initially. So it's all config based, so you can change it to be however you want. And so ends up like that. A few months ago, we had to change it, or we're just challenging everybody at this point because the bot attacks were just so distributed. We couldn't.
Yeah.
And even we started out just by like the first 2 octets, like a sitter divided by 16. That's how we were rate limiting, like that wide of a range. And even they were more distributed than that. So now we just challenge everybody. We can't.
Yeah, it's exactly what I've been seeing too. It's wild. And there's no way this is all compromised machines. Like it's clearly systems that have been set up to do this. Like how does it make sense they're all compromised when it's in that like sequence?
Yeah, this feels state funded. It's kind of all speculation. I don't really know.
I know it is. I have no evidence beyond what everybody here has been seeing the same thing. I have no evidence beyond the observations I've seen, and I've firewall things that clearly show Brazil going crazy or some of these other countries. And Sean's asking about honeypot. I haven't used there is honeypot modules. There is one, I'm trying to remember the name of it, that basically can catch traffic that are trying to get into your facets, and it can stop them. And there is actual honeypot modules that basically can trick bots into getting stuck in it. I have not implemented any of those myself. I've always just relied on more purpose built things for bots. But I'm curious about anybody else have any experience with implementing a honeypot on your site?
I think that honeypot is not very useful in this situation because you're already into Drupal by the time you get to honeypot. Whereas what we're doing is blocking these things, redirecting them in Apache with that method that I just talked about of not accepting direct URLs. And that seems to work pretty well. But I think that these are just rogue AI bots, people who think if we get enough information, we could sell it to someone, or maybe they're starting their own AI company, but that seems to be what it looks like to me, at least. But otherwise, who knows?
Has anybody outside of the United States seen this particular behavior we're describing? We always see bot attacks on all sites, but I'm talking about this particular style, for lack of a better word, maybe. Okay, you have seen it in Canada. Is it from the specific BRICS countries that we've been seeing? Like, it's mostly, for what we've been seeing, it's mostly in BRICS associated. It's the same countries. So you don't think it's intentional to take the site down? You think it's just like some sort of clumsy AI thing?
That's been my guess. And I think there's a Code for Libs Slack bots channel. I think a lot of people share that. They think it's just gathering data for LLM training. But because this all started last year on Alibaba was a lot of the source of all this, and Tencent. And I know they're both working. Those are two sort of organizations that are trying to build their own model. And then at the beginning of this year, it shifted over to Brazil. So it started in like Singapore, all Alibaba, Tencent IPs, and now it's all Brazil. And I don't really know who owns those IPs, but yeah, whoever it is, that they're well funded, and they're.
No, I looked at a lot of the IP ranges, and I have seen obviously attacks from Tencent and Alibaba. That's always been a thing, and I did see it last year. But what I noticed specifically about these is the ranges are coming from like ISPs and stuff. It could be like it looks like a user network, or it doesn't seem. That's what makes me question if it's an actual company, because it's coming from a broad range of IPs that are coming in that sequence, and they're not even all the same ISP.
I think that some of these folks have figured out a way to spoof IPs as part of it.
I wish I would have said that I came across the GitHub repo a few weeks ago that basically it was a Python library, and it seemed like it was work around this. And because the architecture seemed like it would facilitate what we're seeing with you're kicking off this bot that then has access to this large sort of like swarm network that it can access to. I'll try to find it, but
yeah, if you had that, I'm really curious about that. If you do have it, be interesting. Yeah, I'm curious what other people have been seeing. Like I said, it's just observances when trying to deal with sites that have been getting attacked. So I don't exactly have a huge sample set, and it's basically just my own observances. So if somebody's working on a white paper or actually has some more intel around it, I'd be curious.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I'm curious about what that.
Sean says, curious about IP spoofing too. It was hard to believe the required infrastructure would lend evidence to the state-sponsored theory.
Yeah.
The theory of AI and large language models, using that for training and that kind of thing, that's interesting as well. See a lot of traffic from that. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, we've gone way over time. We're going to have to get this uploaded and distributed. So I certainly appreciate the engagement and all the questions and discussion. Happy to facilitate even another session if we have to at another time. But the next one, of course, as mentioned in the chat there, is on June 4th, A Conscious Thing. We'll be presenting Lost in the Web, bringing everything back together. I want to thank everybody for your time. Thanks, Luke. Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, and I'm in the Islander bot channel bot thing too. So yeah, if you want to, Joe, if you want to drop that link to that repo in there, I'm curious.
Yeah, for sure.
And we will be discussing bots. I'm quite certain at Island Oricon.
We'll be talking
sure there's going to be a lot of interest in that.
Everybody wants to talk about bots because it's
only $80, and you can get a scholarship if you can't afford that. So
yeah, I'll be there.
That, of course, as well. Thanks to Joe and to Carrie for jumping in here and contributing as well.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, appreciate that. All right, thanks very much, everyone. We'll see you again. Bye-bye.